Good day, everyone, and welcome to our first ProTraining technical webinar for the year featuring Dr. Myers from BASF. Before we start, I'd like to review a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Here's a quick review of what you'll see on your screen. To the left of your screen is the viewer where you can see the presentation. To the right is a control panel where you can ask questions. The control panel will collapse automatically when not in use. To keep it open, click the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. You have joined the webinar in listen-only mode, which means you are muted. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end. Via the control panel, you can download resource documents that our presenter has provided by going to the Handouts pane anytime during the webinar. In addition, Alberta applicators can receive recertification credit for attending the webinar. I'll post the form link via the chat window that you can fill out. If you have specific questions on this, you can contact Aaron Foster, one of our regional sales managers. I'll include his contact information in the chat as well. Later today, you will receive a follow-up email containing the webinar recording. With that, let me go ahead and introduce you to today's speaker. Dr. Jason Myers has been a technical service representative for BASF Professional and Specialty Solutions since 2009. Before that, he was a sales representative for BASF for 1 year. Jason graduated from Texas A&M with his doctorate in urban entomology, studying under Dr. Roger Gold on identifying and controlling the invasive tawny crazy ant. A&M, he also held positions as a graduate, research, and teaching assistant. Jason also received an MS in entomology from the University of Arkansas with graduate work emphasizing insect pathology. Jason has multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals and has provided educational materials and articles through professional magazines. He has provided various educational and research presentations in our industry for over 15 years. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody is having a wonderful day and the sun is out and there are no clouds. We are going to be talking about today a product line that is really exceptionally good, not just for Canada, but it has been really exceptional for the United States. And I'll tell you some of the experiences that we've had in an area of the world that has some really high pest pressure, and some of the things that we have learned from down south that will be able to help you, I hope, quite a bit in your endeavors to control the pests that bring Canadians the greatest amount of annoyances and even in some cases medical issues with roaches. We're going to be talking about a wide variety of different subject material, from trends, consumer trends, to the active ingredient that is within the Seclira line, and then a lot of the research that's been done previously, and a lot of the behaviors that are associated with that research that enable Seclira to work better than most, if frankly not all, products, especially in certain situations. And then we'll kind of talk about a little bit about the label and what you are able to do, what your options are. So with that, I will get started with our first slide. One of the things that you can do that Google has, which is potentially very useful for you, is to look up consumer trends. And they have a function within the Google website which enables you to go to a tool. And that tool is called Google Trends, and you can look up search words. Anytime you have search words utilized within the Google website, you can actually follow consumer action of some sort. And typically, those actions are associated with some sort of purchasing, okay? And you can predict when the likelihood of an increase in searches is going to be associated with some sort of desire to do something about a problem or a solution or something to that effect. In this case, we have an example of the search term cockroaches, right? You could look up roaches, you could look up roach, you could look up ants, all right? You can do the same thing with this functionality. And you can see in the top right, they have a score sheet of the Canadian provinces. And you'll see that some of them have a higher hit rate than others do regarding cockroaches. And you can also, they will also give you a pattern or a table that shows you the likelihood. And you can even zero down to within the year. And typically speaking, with cockroaches or bed bugs, you will see a blip that increases fairly significantly. So you could match up your advertisements to associate with these search trends, and a lot of them happen to be around the movement of students, really, because that's when you start to discover certain pests whenever you're moving or you've moved into a new place. So a lot of the time, the highest period of time that these searches happen with pests that are really highly associated with human beings happen to be around the July and August timeframe, which is when students are moving in. And then sometimes you'll notice other minor trends in certain areas. So just keep that in mind. It might be very useful for your marketing purposes, but they really do closely match what humans are going to do, kind of almost a predictive power, if you will. All right, on to the products that we're going to be discussing. The Seclira product line contains dinotefuran. Dinotefuran is a type of neonicotinoid. The neonicotinoid, as you can see from the diagram, works within the neural system or in between neurons typically, okay? And we've got I've got another sort of diagram that describes the fact that we have several different subclasses of neonicotinoids. And within those subclasses, each of them works slightly different. And we have even seen some tremendous differences between those subclasses as to how they work. One great example is houseflies. Houseflies can very easily ramp up resistance to certain insecticides. And we have found that the Seclira line can actually kill houseflies against imidacloprid resistant housefly strains. And and so it's quite a useful tool in some scenarios where you have highly likely or much higher likelihood of having resistance to certain insecticides like you do with houseflies and roaches and even bed bugs. Okay, and so it essentially does both a nerve block and excitation. So you can have a little bit of both, which amounts to a freezing of the, if you will, of the insect. So they'll be can be hyperactive all of a sudden, and then suddenly, bam, they're down for the count and basically completely still before they finally perish. But you'll the biggest the coolest thing is to watch a housefly die from exposure to this, because it goes absolutely crazy and then suddenly collapses in death. So if you enjoy that sort of thing, this is right up your alley. You can watch it happen right before your eyes. All right, so we have all sorts of different insecticides and how they work within insects. And specific to um, neonicotinoids is the group 4A, okay? And group 4A within the IRAC system points out that this is working within the nervous system. You can see there's a number of other insecticide classes that work within this, and each of them work slightly different, even though they all work within the nervous system. And so we can actually jump from class to class, and hopefully we prevent some of these resistance issues from popping up, especially with pests that are likely to be highly resistant, like bedbugs, roaches, or German roaches, and houseflies, right? All right, so mentioned this earlier, the subclasses. There's lots of different subclasses within neonicotinoids, right? So we've got 4 major groups. Each of them works slightly different, and you can have vastly different results depending on the pest and the strain of pest that you are working with. So if you ever have suspicions of, my goodness, I'm not doing very well at this particular account by using X product that has neonicotinoid in it, why you can start to suspect that you've got some potential issue. But of course, you need to make sure that you're actually applying it correctly and all those basic things before you start to have suspicions of having a potential for resistance. What we've also found is that there are a few different universities that have looked at combination products. One example is on your screen, and in some cases, the resistance to one active ingredient can overcome the susceptibility of the other ingredient that is within the same product. And if you separate those actives out and they expose them, then they die accordingly. But that resistance can actually prohibit the other active ingredient from working. So we have to be really careful with some of the combination products. Okay, it all depends on how they work intimately within the insect immune system. Okay. All right, so there's a number of different attributes that Seclira has, and we're going to go over each of these individually and kind of knock them out as we go. And we're going to first start off with the undetectable, all right, which simply means that an insect will pass over a treated area, which is indicated here by the dotted line or dotted rectangle, okay, and they will move right over a treated surface to get to whatever avenue they want. They want food or water or shelter or whatever it is. And so we have to think about also, not only are we putting out undetectable material, but where are we placing these materials relative to the behaviors associated with these individual pests? If we put them in areas where they're less likely to spend time on them, then guess what? We probably need to be spraying a little bit more, a larger area within this environment, depending upon what the label allows. Okay, and so we have to have an additive effect where we need to expose these insects to the material in enough fashion that we can elicit some sort of mortal dose. Okay, so we need to be able to expose them, and we'll kind of get into a little bit of that without getting too boring. But we'll get into a little bit of that with some of the descriptions of some of these other products. All right, so one thing that has to do with the US EPA is the dinotefuran active has actually been granted a reduced risk status. So this might be useful for you in your discussions with your clientele, make them feel a little bit better or more comfortable with the product that you are choosing. Okay, so this may just may help you in the one-on-one type situations. But how do they calculate this? They look at a relatively low impact on human health relative to other products. Everything is relative to other products that are on the market. lower toxicity to non-target organisms, say like birds and fish and plants, lower potential for groundwater contamination, meaning that it's going to stick to whatever surface that it's on um, better than water moving it off of the surface. Low use rates and low pest resistance potential, which we do have actually quite in spades with this particular product because it has not been within the urban landscape for very long, and even less time in Canada. Right? And then is it compatible with IPM practices? And IPM practices can be a slew of different things, but is it going to interfere? And one of the biggest things that could potentially interfere is the repellency factor. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit, but because we talked about just a couple minutes ago about the undetectable nature of Seclira, you've got that which can coincide and work quite nicely within IPM practices. All right, so how do you measure repellency? Well, you give certain animals, depending on which ones they are, in this case, German roaches, you give them an offering of harborage in a treated area and a harborage in a non-treated area. Or you might even put the same products within the same arena. And as you can see here, the dotted line represents the average. So if you have something that is it's like water, right? So the untreated surface, which is the top one, you should have pretty much a 50-50 breakup. But as you look down in the bottom, you can see that Seclira actually matches up quite nicely with the untreated, which is simply water. So you can tell, okay, initially these roaches were disturbed by the water, presence of the water, but then they over time kind of averaged back out and went right back into the site after roughly 10 to 30 minutes. Okay, but then with the repellent materials, you can see that there is a vast difference in where they are hanging out. They did not want to be in that harborage over that 10 to 60 minutes. Okay, but with Seclira, you notice that that repellency does not occur, and it much more closely matches what you see with water applications. Okay. All right. So we also have transfer effect, and transfer effect can get a little bit complicated, but we're going to simplify this in a couple of different, actually a few different examples. Okay, and this is kind of some of the neater research that has been done within within our pests that we have. Here's one that people don't really think about, and that is the Seclira roach bait. For this particular test, we actually glued the mouth parts of the German roach shut. And so, not because we were tired of listening to them, complain, but because we wanted them to not consume the material and then compare the results. So you look at the dark blue represents contact only, which are the individuals that had their mouth parts glued. And then you've got ingestion. And the ingestion means that they were capable of consuming the material. And you can see that really, there's really no discernible difference. Statistically speaking, they're the same. And then I always view it as, are you gonna see a difference in the field? And I think it's pretty clear, you're not gonna see a difference within the field. So the amount of mortality that's associated with it depended upon them really picking up the material. So frankly, palatability of the bait for the most part doesn't even matter. They can still die at pretty much the same rate just by touching the material. There are some technicians that will try and compare baits, and they'll put them side by side. It's kind of a bad way to look at it because over time, certain baits can be attractive, or they might walk on it, they might be interested in it, but they might not consume very much of it, or they'll consume a whole bunch of it initially, and then over time, as it ages, they'll start to slow down. It's been a very poor indicator from what we have learned as to how well a product is going to do within the field. So something to keep in mind. Okay, here is another test that was done in this case on black carpenter ants, where you have treated materials. And I'm going to open up my laser pointer. So you have a say an untreated control group, and then you spray this group, and then you put parts of them that were sprayed into untreated workers. Okay, and so let's say we took one individual that was treated and we put it in this group of 50, 5, and put them into a group of 50. So that's 2 to 10%. All right. And that actually very closely mimics the amount of individuals that typically forage throughout all the different species of ants. Around 2 to 10% are out there foraging. And quite often we only have access to the ones we see. We're not always able to find the nest, right? Or the nest might be off site. So what are we going to do when the area that we really need to treat is unavailable to us? So we need to be able to control the ants because they can learn to come back to the structure, which has also been proven over time. Okay, just based off of their behavior, if you only kill the foraging ants, eventually you're going to have a problem at the structure again because they're going to find it again. Because the old ants, or not the old ants, but the foraging ants were killed, but then you've still got a whole slew of ants at the nest that can come back and find the structure. And they've proven that in both field tests and within the lab. And you can see here over on the right, what is your average percent mortality within the recipients, meaning these groups, okay? And you can see in the controls, there were no deaths in the controls. This is where the zeros are, and we would see gray bars if that was the case. And we see the 1 to 50 rate, which is 2% versus the 10% rate, and you really don't see much of a difference at all. Again, these are unlikely results to see a difference within the field. And by day 3, you've got 100% control within the recipients. So theoretically speaking, you can kill a whole colony just by treating the foraging ants. Broad spectrum, and I've got another example too, which we're going to come back to and kind of give you a better idea of another ant pest that has been increasing in Canada. But I've got that in a different position right now. Okay, so broad spectrum, the labels we're going to kind of get into. So you've got some choices. You've got Seclira pressurized, Seclira cockroach gel bait, and the Seclira WSG, which can be diluted and then sprayed on and in the structure. So how do we work? We can use these materials in cracks and crevice treatments, which are depending on the pest that is going to be the avenue of application that is most likely. Although if you're using, say I'm going to go back a slide, say if you're using the cockroach gel bait, you don't necessarily want to be placing that inside of a crack and crevice. You want to be about, let's say that we've got like this is a wall and a floor or inside of a cabinet that you need to treat. You want to move off of that about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch and place down a dot, all right? And that's about a 1/4 gram dot that you're looking for. Looks basically the size of a pea, okay? So in that case, you're not desiring to do crack and crevice applications because you want as much material to be consumed as possible. Some people will put it in lines, but it's just not an efficient use of roach baits. Okay, we want you to be efficient. You won't hear manufacturers very often say, hey, don't use too much of our material. So you can save a little bit and you can get a little bit more out of it. And your results are going to be a lot better. Then you've got indoor perimeter treatments. Anything that's associated with the outside wall is going to be a potential avenue for pests coming in and out of that structure. Excuse me. Then you can have spot applications, okay, so not greater than 0.2 of a square meter. And you're going to want to do your best to use those judiciously so that you're not overcoming a particular area, but that you're working within that total surface, because you can't exceed the total surface area of 10%. But in some cases, you might come pretty darn close to that. Just depends on your situation. Okay, and then you've got void applications, which can be incredibly important for German roach work. That is, if you've got really high populations, this is something to really focus on. If you think you've got a large population of German roaches within a wall, by golly, those void applications are really essential to overcoming the large population. And so, anyway, okay. All right, so what kind of pests are controlled? We have a wide variety of different pests that can be controlled by Seclira. Frankly, there's a lot more to this list that we've looked at, but this is what you have available and listed within your labeling, okay? So you can read that. Here are the ones that within the US that we focus on. We look at German roaches, houseflies, ants, fleas, and then we have the occasional invaders. And there's a variety pack of occasional invaders that we've looked at. And sometimes they're on the, some of them are on the label, some of them are not. But just keep in mind, man, when we've gone up against these random occasional invaders, we've had a really nice success. In some cases, we did not expect that level of success because of where they land on a structure. But anyway, these are the ones that we really focus on. And there's another one that I would really add to that list for you guys, because you have so few quality tools, and that is bed bugs. Okay, this can be a really nice couple of products with the Seclira pressurized and the Seclira WSG that you can utilize in a very nice fashion, especially compared to what you have available to you. Okay. So treatment options, we went over the crack and crevice, spot and void applications, but it doesn't include, the crack and crevice applications do not include the treatment of exposed surfaces. So that would be more towards the spot treatment. Say you've got bed bugs kind of in a little bit of an open area and they're away from a crack and crevice spot, which can happen. You've got that spot application that you can utilize within the environment. Okay. All right. So WSG, what is this? This is a water-soluble granule. And once and I've got a video of this, once you put this into suspension, it stays in suspension. Now, just keep in mind, we say things sometimes like continue to agitate, but frankly, we've let this material set for over a month, and it does not partition out. It does not. It does not move to the bottom of the container. It's what we consider a true solution, which means it stays in suspension. And for your purposes, my goodness, it stays there. Sometimes you got it sitting there over the weekend or for a week for whatever reason, and you come right back to it. You don't necessarily need to agitate. It might make you feel better, but you don't necessarily need to do that. And it'll come out in the same form that it came out when you freshly shook it up, right? Okay. All right, so for example, housefly applications apply to the outside surfaces of screens, doors, window frames. Really what you're looking for is wherever they're likely to alight or land, that's where we want to be applying these materials. It depends on the definition of dumpsters as to what the structures count as, but you've got man-made structures oftentimes around dumpsters, and those can be really useful areas to apply to, which then increases your likelihood of being able to contact those flies and affect the overall population, and hopefully preventing them from coming indoors. Then you've got exterior applications where you could be, where the pest rests. So where, you're just thinking about behaviors of those particular pests, whether they be the flies or other random insects that you could be treating for. All right, here's a little fuller list, which gets you down all the way down from ants to stored product pests. Mostly beetles. We've tested this against a wide variety of different stored product pests, and it is really, really good. This is something that that I really highly suggest you concentrate on, because there's a lot of PMPs even in the U.S. that don't really focus on that group, and man, is it good on those stored product pests. All right, so we've got a re-entry level. Once the spray is dried, you can come back in. So for example, WSG, depending on how heavily you apply material, could be dried within 30 minutes, right? Depends on the pressure that you're creating, right? You can't go over 50 PSI, which is on the label, but the higher the pressure, the smaller the droplet size is, which means that will dictate how quickly something can dry, right? And then of course, is the air around it in the vicinity dry as well? Obviously in the wintertime, you get the drier the air, the quicker it is going to evaporate, right? You can have outdoor applications. You can apply where insects are found on the structure, applying to any of the foraging ant trails, or say houseflies that might be landing on those outside structures. For PPE, you're looking at no respirator unless you're in a confined space, typical language. The rest involves gloves and long sleeve shirts, the typical PPE materials. You can have wide use sites like animal housing, which we'll show here in a minute, campgrounds, schools, lots of different things. So your options are really fairly wide within this area, and we've already talked about the wide spectrum of pests. We've got some down in the United States that are listed off that are not on your label. So if you're treating for one pest, you could be quite easily controlling other pests as well. Okay, so let's get to fast knockdown, strong residual. Argentine ants, right? Argentine ants are going to be typically down in the south, really high populations. So this is like an extreme nature type situation, but it also matches up with odorous house ants, which are becoming even plentiful within Canada as odorous house ants continue to march onward, if it were. So you can see here on the left table, you've got concrete surface applications, 28-day residual, and then on the right you've got another porous surface. When we generally term porous surfaces, usually we're talking about wood, typically. Okay, but you can see here 28-day and 24-day knockdown and mortality combined, and it's really good. And concrete is a nasty surface because it absorbs so much material so quickly. So keep that in mind. Here's another example in this case we looked at carpenter ants, where we treated again, just like in that donor recipient model that we showed you earlier with carpenter ants. We've done very similar and had very similar results with odorous house ants. Okay, again, 1 or 5 individuals, and move on. And WSG, you can see the results here, but I'm going to overlay something that you probably heard of that we have here in the US, which is Terminor, and that is the absolute standard here within the US, where we combine, or we compare these two products, and you overlay the results that we did have using the same setup, and you almost have identical results as far as transfer effect, which is absolutely been tremendous here in the United States, because we got a much more expanded label usage with Alpine WSG compared to that of Terminor, which of course you do not have, want to emphasize, in Canada, right? All right, so cat fleas, we've got options here. We've got direct applications to both larval and adult forms, and you can see it does really well on cat fleas. Just keep in mind, the more material you use, the more likely you are to get down to the piling, which is where the larvae are, okay? But of course, the more volume you use, the more likely it is to increase your time to drying. And then of course that dictates re-entry for the homeowner back into the treated surfaces, right? So just keep that in mind. The more volume you increase, the longer it's going to take to dry. Pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes it's nice to say the obvious. Houseflies. We've got houseflies on for residual on tiles, and on cement and on wood. Okay, and so when we're talking about anywhere from hours out to days, okay, we're looking at some pretty nice residual, and you don't really see much of a difference when you're looking at 24 hours out. Okay, so we're looking at some pretty rough surfaces with both concrete and wood materials. Bedbug material. These are direct applications at the 0.1% rate, and you get to 100% control very quickly on some surfaces. We've noted here in the U.S. we can get with non-porous surfaces, you can end up with quite a long residual. But again, porous surfaces are more likely to soak up the material and have more issues with exposure. And you're going to find that with every insecticide out there. The only insecticide that we've got here in the U.S. that does really well on porous surfaces is Phantom, which unfortunately you do not have. But all the other products are going to have some pretty significant issues on getting residual when you have porous surfaces. So just kind of keep that in mind as a general rule. Here we've got, again, a non-porous surface and tile, and you've got 90-day control against bed bugs with the Seclira pressurized, and only takes 6 hours of them resting on a surface, and this is non-detectable, so they're going to hang out in these particular areas. They're not going to be agitated by it, and they're not going to leave and skedaddle to stay away from that surface and then give you problems later on down the line. The other thing, and now this includes two products that you do not have in Canada, but I want you to concentrate on the green, which is the representation of Seclira pressurized, and I couldn't whatever. I forgot to overlay the Alpine with the Seclira. It's the same exact formulation, same product. So you look for the green line results, and you can see that you have an 89% reduction in egg hatch. So you've killed 89% of the bedbug eggs when you're utilizing Seclira pressurized. So that is really fantastic news, and should be something to be able to tout. Hey, I can kill bedbug eggs right here and right now, and so that's something that's really quite useful. American roaches, we've got much larger individuals here than German roaches, and the Seclira WSG at the high rate can really eliminate American roaches really quickly. So this is an example of when you might, not always, might want to use the high rate. Okay, the other time that you want to use the high rate is whenever you're looking at maintenance rates where you've got low populations, and you can go with the lower rate. Okay, but in some of these larger bodied insects like American roaches, using the higher rate is not necessarily a bad thing. You can still get away with the low rate with American roaches, but just understand it's just going to take a little bit longer for that low rate to take effect because there's just less material that's going to get into their system more quickly. Okay. Here we got cellar spiders. We actually have really nice results on spiders. We don't really talk about it very much here in the US, but it's actually a pretty good spider product. And so you can see here the results, and this is at the middle rate or the 0.2% rate with Seclira. And it doesn't take too long; it just takes a few days for them to succumb to it. But hey, that's pretty good for an animal that does not touch very much surface within a given environment. It's actually really good results. Springtails, these incidental occasional pests, you get 100% control really quickly. I mean, you can eliminate a lot of springtail issues by using Seclira WSG. More occasional invaders, so both centipedes and millipedes here in the top and bottom respectively. And you've got high rate, and don't ask me why we got high rate and the middle rate difference in these, but these have done really well here in the US when we get it out into the field. Just does massively well on millipedes are the highest likelihood of pest here in the US. So it kind of gives you at least a decent idea, especially when people are bringing in plants from the outdoors and then they're bringing them inside. At some point, these are pests that pop up quite quickly. Yellow jackets. So here, the thing about the yellow jackets, yes, you can control absolutely with Seclira WSG, but the important factor here is their behavior or their reaction to the active ingredient. There's a lot of materials that are available where you can have these pyrethroid usage, and it can cause excitation in yellow jackets and other stinging wasps. Okay, and when you have that, you, the technician, do not want that, right? You don't want to cause excitation. You don't want to upset them and tick them off. You want them to be calm, right? And so with this active ingredient, they remain calm. They will react initially to the actual physical spray, but then they'll calm down right away, or fairly right away, like within a minute or so. You can see that they get agitated, but then they calm right back down. Whereas with pyrethroid applications, they can get excited and they get really angry and then they start searching for a problem, right? All right, so here's a really nice example of something we did in the field where we looked at a combination of a competitor within the U.S., which is partially available within Canada. At least one of the products is. And you look at combining Seclira roach gel bait with Seclira WSG, and you end up getting much more significantly consistent control over time, which is really important, I think, is just have that consistency of control. The other thing about this particular project is it reduced the German roach numbers down to 0 more often than the other products that we used. And that is also really big in my eyes, is reducing it down to 0. And that's just off of one application. So, that's a really cool result from the field. And that was in an apartment complex, by the way. Here is Seclira WSG in a commercial swine facility. I'll show you some pictures here in a second, where really we're hunting for houseflies, but we also incidentally had moth and black-eyed fruit flies within this environment, incidentally as well, and those numbers went massively down, which we'll show you here in a second. So you can see some of the sticky traps that were placed out, and you can see the numbers, and so there's really significant high-end numbers. And these are what the facility looked like. Here's where everything was applied after the swine were removed from the facility. You sprayed against the walls where the pigs could not stand up. Okay, so like say you got a pig that could stand up to say 5 feet or so. We stayed away from those surfaces and sprayed up here on the ceilings and any other surfaces that could be reasonably applied. Okay, without exposing um, the pigs to it. Right. Here are the results. In green, you can see the water-based controls, and then the Seclira went down to 0 right away within a day, which is frankly nuts when you really think about it, because there's so many flies in these facilities um, that it's really quite amazing. But again, it also controlled those other incidental flying pests, the moth flies and the black-eyed fruit flies, which if you've ever had to deal with black-eyed fruit flies, which I'm sure you are dealing with, um, they have just run rampant here in the US and restaurants and the like. And man, have they become an issue for people. And this is a huge potential problem solver with Seclira WSG. Although off the top of my head, and Brad's going to have to correct me, I don't know if black-eyed fruit flies are on the WSG label. But at any rate, that potential is out there. All right, so we've got a video here. Whoops, oh, I got to click on this here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what you'll see here, and I'm going to fast forward through parts of this, that you'll see as the material comes into the solution, and we look at it over time, and we mix it up, and it will stay in solution, okay? And then, so what you do is you just basically stir it over, say, a few minute period. You don't need to constantly stir. You just stir every now and then it'll go into this true solution, and it'll stay in that solution really well. So like I said, you don't have to constantly agitate it in order to do that, but you do that over a couple of times within a few minutes, and vast majority of that material will be placed in the solution, and then you don't really have to worry about it. Okay. All right, moving on, if I can. Oh, move on, come on now. All right, this is what it looks like on the bottom right after a month of just sitting there, okay? So you can see the dates here marked in here. This is what it looks like after a month of just sitting there. It doesn't precipitate out like we see with some of these other solutions that we have here in the US, where it all moves down to the bottom and then you pour it out and you've still got this material sitting down there in the bottom. You just don't see that with Seclira WSG. Again, Alpine is Seclira WSG. Also, what we've discovered is that we can't find anything it stains. It doesn't mean that something out there might be stainable, but man, have we had a hard time finding anything. We spray on glass at the high rate, and you'll see on this video as we spray and we allow it to dry, we don't see it on dark surfaces. All these different. There we go. Move. I'm trying to get this played too. Okay, so then you see the video on the right as it's allowed to dry. You don't see any of that surface. It's not really necessarily staining, even if you were to find it, but you just need to wipe it off of that particular surface with a wet rag or something. But we have not yet found anything that stains, carpeting, anything. So hey, man, I'll tell you what, if you're the first one, maybe you get like a some sort of lunch gift card or something. But we've gone so far as our lawyers even say, hey, listen, this thing clearly doesn't stain. We've had it in millions of homes at this point. We can't find a surface that stains. So, okay, resistance management. You guys are going to find, all these store-bought items, most of which are going to are going to contain pyrethroid material. And guess what? We have resistance in all these different pests that the homeowners and apartment dwellers are treating for. From German roaches to the bed bugs to ants, this is going to be potentially problematic. It can work alongside of it, right? But man, get these out of there if you can. Try and explain why you're trying to get rid of them. I don't want any repellency within your kitchen. I don't want any repellency. I want our product to interact with the pests. I don't want to keep them out. I want to eliminate them, right? Another thing is you've got aversion issues. So I've got on the top left here, averse strains, which means they avoid certain types of baits, which really means that they are avoiding a certain type of sugar that is within the bait as an attractant for German roaches. Then you have other examples where you've got a tolerant to indoxacarb, a strain that's tolerant, which means it's in between susceptibility and full susceptibility and a fully resistant population, like you've got down here. And even here, as you can see here, some of these pyrethroid materials are actually in some of these products. So really this, when it's in the lab, when it sits in the lab too long, it stops being resistant and becomes tolerant, and then you can't even then you can actually just kill it outright. So you got to be careful about some of these claims, even within some of these research labs. How long have they been sitting in the lab, not exposed to pyrethroids? So if they're not a healthy population, they end up losing that resistance over time. So these claims of resistance, not all that it's cracked up to be. Okay. Here's some examples that we've had here in the US of some of the research that they found on pyrethroid-resistant bed bugs. These are resistant to a bifenthrin, pyrethroid, deltamethrin, which you find in demand, beta-cyfluthrin, or not demand, sorry, the lambda-cyhalothrin is in demand, out of Ohio State. But all these different pyrethroids have demonstrated at one point in time pyrethroid resistance within certain populations, especially when they're fresh from the field. Okay. All right. So you got my warning about resistance issues, and I think we can open it up for questions.
Hey, Jason, thanks so much for providing such a, informative information to us. I am going to go and look because we did get several questions that have come in.
Excellent.
So let me start looking here.
See if I can open up my chat function and see what I can see.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to be able to see them or not,
Yeah.
but here's one asking, what's the recommended application rate for the gel bait?
Brad, you're gonna have to help me with that one because there's certain amounts I'm sure you're not allowed to go past. But it's for me,
Brad,
just kind of a general answer. It's going to depend on the population size that you're dealing with. Sometimes you're going to need to put out more bait placements relative to the population pressure. Brad, you start to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's not prescribed in the label on how much. So it's really, Jason, you go ahead and talk about best practices because that's what we leave it up to the applicator.
Yeah, so you're there on site and you can make a much better judgment. I think this is part of what I always call the artistic part of pest control is that when a label doesn't define exactly how much you need to be placing out or not placing out within a given environment, it's behooved up to you. Don't go crazy. There's a lot of right now. There's a lot of requests by certain individuals within the United States to put roach bait in these little folded waxy papers, and they're like little squares, and then they fold them up to look like triangles, and then they put this line of roach product. The problem is if that gets carried off by anything or moved away from that surface, then you've got potential non-target applications. I really highly suggest against doing that. But again, just use those little droplets. They're 1/4 gram droplets. You can get a bunch of applications, 120 different applications from that tube based off of quarter gram droplets of those pea-size droplets, and place those out in the environment and just do it relative to the number of roaches that you see and the relative number of roach evidences, meaning, like, oh, okay, I see some fecal droplets here, and some other, German roach barf marks over here, and then I'm gonna kind of associate that. But that's when I tend to leave it up to the individual that's involved in that site, that's had experience at that site, knows how many pests they're dealing with.
Jason, actually, I was wrong. There, I mean, I just found it on the
Okay.
label. The bait point should be every 10 to 20 centimeters. And then for light infestations, 4 to 6 bait points per 10 square meters. For moderate infestations, 7 through 11 bait points per 10
Okay.
square meters. And for heavy infestations, 12 to 24. So it's a little bit prescriptive, but still a lot of art to application, I would say.
Yeah, so that still leaves up a lot to be. What I would recommend is that if you've got a high population within a given little tiny pocket, is that you use the minimum distance between applications, because sometimes you want to, frankly, I would want to put like 4 or 5 dots in a row right next to one another that are like half an inch to an inch apart. That way they're more likely to gather around that spot. But since you've got a minimum distance of 10 centimeters, what I would do is go with that 10 centimeters in these populations where you got high pockets of population, because you want the aggregation pheromones to really start kicking in. So it's unfortunate that the label kind of limits you in that way. It's kind of like the rodent control model, which is just ridiculous, and that, oh, do it a certain distance apart. What you should be really allowed to do is put them appropriate to the population and where they're active. But yeah, so it kind of further complicates your guys' situation, but try and minimize that as much as possible.
Jason, the only other thing I would mention here is that it's probably good to go with smaller drop size, especially on vertical surfaces, because it is a little on the runnier side, this bait.
Yeah, and if you stick to that pea size, you're really not going to see too much runniness. It's where people get in trouble when they try to make something larger, or put a horizontal line on a vertical surface, and then you'll see that droopage, and you just don't want that to happen. So the smaller the better.
Thanks, guys. Here's another question that came in asking, does it always take a few days? Other countries are using stronger pesticides and roaches are carried over and creating a resistance to chemicals used here. How does Seclira work compared to chemicals being used overseas and the US?
All right, so comparatively within the US, we have Seclira WSG, and what PMPs are finding is that they're used to using pyrethroids in these what were previously thought of as cheap environments, where you've got restaurants that don't like to pay very much money for pest control, and you end up inherently with so many callbacks that it takes away all of your potential profit. I'd say all of it, but the huge chunks of it. And so when you can reduce the number of callbacks, that's what pest control companies here in the US have been focusing on, where hey, you know what? Why should I keep showing back up to all these places? Why not just do it once and be done with it? So a lot of them are finding out that you can do German roach cleanouts with Alpine WSG, or excuse me, with Seclira WSG alone. And so they're finding that, okay, you don't have necessarily immediate control of directly applied pests, but you're going to be waiting 24 hours, maybe, frankly. Okay, so it's not as hot as some of those other products, but what you're doing is you're trading 24 hours for real serious long-term control versus like immediate, oh, I need something done within an hour, right? So you got to set that expectation with the customer and say, hey, bear with me for 24 48 hours and see where we're at. And so what they've been seeing is that the restaurant industry and other areas where they typically like something immediate, they're finding a heck of a lot more patience with their customers, and then they're getting rid of their problem instead of having this ongoing issue that lasts seemingly forever.
All right, Jason, thanks. Here's another question asking, can we use WSG in an Actisol fogger?
So I'm gonna, Brad, real quick, yes, no? I'm thinking, here in the US, you bet, but I just want to make sure.
Brad, you're muted.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
trying to look to see on the label. In Canada,
it
it's
says not to
fairly,
go above 50 psi. So that to me is kind of tricky. But here's the thing is about what you're basically doing is taking Seclira WSG and turning it into what is effectively an aerosol through an Actisol unit or similar machinery. And what we found with other field work that we've done and some experiments that we've done is that you end up with a much greater bioavailability when you create smaller droplets and you spread it over a lot better that way. And so as long as that sucker doesn't go above the 50 psi, which I think is mentioned within the label,
yes.
then I would think that you're good to go. But I'd check on that Actisol unit, see how much psi you're pumping out. But gosh, quite frankly, it really does a lot of good for you to put that through an Actisol unit. It really increases availability of the product to the pests. So if you're able to do that, thumbs up. But just check on that.
All right, here's the next question asking, has Seclira been developed in liquid-based insecticide already pre-mixed with an insecticide bottle versus granular Seclira WSG formulation?
No, we've never done that. This was the original formulation. So it's, it's easier for shipment and everything. So it's, lighter weight and all that good stuff.
Jason, the pressurized can is really that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry, didn't think about that.
Okay. Looks like we're getting a couple comments asking, let me see if I can expand my list here. Folks are saying, what about, I guess they're having customers that spray Raid over the top of their treatment. What do you recommend? What should they do?
That's what's real bad. Yeah,
Mhm.
so what that does is that causes minimally an intense repellency to that product,
Mhm.
which can then just eliminates the whole point of having something that's undetectable. And so what you can see, and it depends on the test and how it's run and all that, you can see a reduction of repellency over time. The question is, how much time does that take to stop that repellency? And that is that's a question. I don't have an answer to it, and I guarantee you SC Johnson and Clorox, they are not looking into that anytime soon. But for you, it's not good. It is no bueno. If you can convince your customers to stop doing that and tell them that it's going to cause problems and it's going to interfere with the type of product that you are using, then more power to you. But it can be easier said than done.
Mm-hmm. We are past the top of the hour, but we still have a few more questions. So if you guys can hang on maybe another 5 more minutes, let's see if we can get through these. That's great. That's great to have all this interest. So this question's asking, how long will WSG still be potent in the reservoir when it gets mixed?
Oh, gotcha. As long as it's not in an extreme situation, like, it's sitting out in your truck down in Tucson, Arizona for, days on end, it can, degradation of the material in a canister that does not contain sunlight is going to start around 130 or so degrees, give or take, and is going to slowly ramp up until most, if not all of it's gone at about 180 degrees. Now, what situation are you going to encounter that in? Good luck, because even in Arizona, even if you let it set out, inside of a tin can, it's going to be really hard to get to, say something like 150. As far as freezing goes, it can withstand tons of freeze-thaw cycles. So as cold as you can get it, even in Canada, you're not going to get to the point where it's going to cause degradation. The cold does not have a factor on viability of the insecticide. Heat does.
Okay. Here's like 3 different questions, but I'm going to try to group them together for you, Jason, and hopefully it won't be too difficult for you to answer them. But they're asking, is the gel effective for bed bugs at contact? I'm not sure I understood.
Yeah.
And then the next one's asking, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. I can
I was
answer
just going
that
to
one,
ask
or you
about,
can go if it's related. Go
yeah,
ahead.
this one kind of says, after the gel's applied, how long will it continue to work effectively? And then, is the Seclira gel bait for roaches effective on Asian cockroaches? So I just grouped all 3 of those together.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is about bedbugs incidental contact, which is kind of what we did in a way with the German roaches and the gluing of the mouth parts, right? So it could easily kill bedbugs if they incidentally contact it. Now, whether or not they're going to be attracted to it in the first place, which German roaches are attracted to it, so they're going to go up to it minimally and then touch it and interact with it. Whereas bed bugs would have to be accidental, if you will, where they're like, oh gosh, I'm going to run into this. You are much better off using the aerosol version than you are the roach gel bait. And Brad can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the pest needs to be listed on the label, which is not listed on the cockroach label specific to bed bugs, right? So there is that to keep in mind.
That's correct. Bed bugs are on the pressurized as well as WSG.
Right. Okay, and then so, oh man, I already lost your second one.
It was just saying, like, after the gel's applied, how long will it continue to work effectively?
Okay, so we did a study, a very long-term study, down in Puerto Rico, of all places, that was run, and it went six months out, and you had an original application for German roaches, and it actually went up against 4 other competitor products that are available here in the U.S. None of those are available up in Canada, but it went up against those 4, and the Seclira roach gel bait was the only one that lasted and kept the mortality rates above 90% throughout the whole life of the study, out to 6 months. The other ones started to fail like a month out. And so those were no longer viable or no longer palatable after just even a few weeks, which is really kind of surprising when you really think about it. But that sucker, the Seclira cockroach shell bait the effects of it lasted a very long time, which is clearly, when you compare it to 4 other competitors, which are really good products, that's like astronomically good. All right, third question. What was that one?
Is the Seclira gel bait for roaches effective on Asian cockroaches?
Oh yeah. Okay, so we have not tested on Asian cockroaches. Those are some weird oddballs, even though they look exactly like German roaches. They will fly, which is really how you tell the difference, other than really looking at it under the scope. But you can try it, I suppose. But again, I think you're going to have that on the label there. But if my memory serves, and it's been like over 15 years, go ahead, Brad.
I was just wondering if Oriental is the same as Asian cockroaches.
No, it is not.
Okay, thank you.
Asians are look exactly like German roaches, but they fly.
Mm.
Orientals are those big fat mamas.
Okay, thanks.
That are like the females are wingless. Okay, so so you could try it as long as it's legal, right? But if my memory serves, and again, I say it's been over 15 years since I was monkeying around with Asian roaches actually in the field, and you can get them if you combine beer and bread. So they should go to that. Now, what in the world you do with them, that information beyond that, I don't know. But they like beer and bread, beer and soggy bread.
Oh.
Yeah. Don't forget to drink one for yourself.
We have actually exceeded our time, and so there were a few questions that we weren't able to address, but I would encourage you to reach out to your Veseris sales rep, and they would be more than happy to assist you with any questions you have on today's presentation. In addition, later this afternoon, you will be receiving an email, and it will contain the recording to the webinar as well as the contact information for Veseris. And then I know there were a couple of folks that had said they were having issues accessing the link for the form for the Alberta applicators recertification, but I did get word that some folks were able to fill it out. So I would say to those folks, just please try again. But if you are continuing to have issues accessing that form, then reach out to Erin Foster at the email address I did post into the chat. So with that, I want to say thanks to Jason and Brad and for everyone attending today. And on behalf of BASF and Veseris, thank you and have a great rest of your day. Bye, folks.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.